You know when you ever try to learn something new and then they use all of these fancy words that doesn't make sense to you? Like whoever is making the video for beginners forgets that you might not know all of these words at all. So in today's video, I will be talking about the terminology of the 3D world and try to explain those words that you didn't quite understand when you try to get into 3D and try to make some sense out of them. So roll intro. Hey, and welcome to another video. So happy to see you here. If you haven't hit that subscribe button, make sure to do so. And if you like this video, then the best way to support us is to leave a thumbs up. Now, let's dive into some words and their meaning. So the first word that I really want to look at is 2D. I mean, to really understand 3D, you kind of have to make some sense out of 2D first. The way I try to explain it is that 2D is seeing things flat, like looking at a paper drawing. It's just existing on that flat surface. We often talk about this and X and Y. Think of 2D as something that doesn't have volume. Now that we know that 2D is just two directions, X and Y, we can also understand that adding depth or another direction to it gives us three directions or three dimensions, which means that we get a 3D model. We can also say that this is a 2D model with depth to it. This creates an X, Y, and Z system, and 3D is actually how we view the world around us. When you look at tutorials explaining 3D models, the word mesh often comes up. A mesh is what we call the complete 3D model that we have created. A mesh can consist of different components, also called elements. When making a 3D replica of something, we usually say that what is a separate piece in the real life should be a separate piece on the model. Like if you take a hammer, you have the shaft and the hammerhead, which can then be one mesh but two elements. All 3D models consists of something we call vertexes or vertices. This is the smallest unit we have in 3D modeling. In reality, this is just a visualization of a point in 3D space, a coordinate, if you will. When we connect two vertices, we get an edge. An edge is the visual representation of the math of the space in between these two vertices. When we connect four vertices, we get a polygon, also called a quad. In some instances, you might recognize it as a face, depending on the software you're using. What most people find confusing about quads is that they think of a square, but it can have any shape it wants as long as it consists of four vertices. A quad is the visual representation of the math of the space in between those four vertices. Every quad consists of two triangles. And tris and triangles is another word that you might come across. The simplest way to think of a tris is just to take a quad and divide it by two. High poly. High poly is what we call a mesh that has a lot of polygons or quads. These meshes take way more time to calculate, but tends to be a lot more detailed as they have more detail to show. Retopology. Retopology is when we take a high poly model and make a low poly model that contains the same silhouette as the high poly. Low poly. Low poly is what we call a mesh that contains a low amount of polys or quads. These doesn't contain as much detail as a high poly, but are a lot easier for the computer to calculate. Baking. Baking is when we take the detailed... This way allows artists to create cheap models with a lot of details, which is what gives us so great graphics in games these days. UV unwrapping is like peeling the skin off an apple or removing the wrapper from a Kinder Egg. It allows us to lay the model out flat on a surface and create textures on it. So when we pack it back on the model, it can have the texture we want it to have. UV shells or UV islands. Just like a mesh can contain elements, a UV can contain shells or islands. Often you have to split the UVs of your mesh into smaller pieces to keep it from stretching too much. So then we cut it up and get UV islands. You can think of UV islands in the same way that we think of elements or components for the mesh itself. Texturing. Texturing is like painting your model to look the way you want it to. Once you have your model UV unwrapped, you can give it colors and add other values to that UV, making your model look like wood or glass or maybe some part of metal, and another is looking like skin. Animation. Most people have somewhat of an understanding of what animation is because we've seen it so many times. Simply put, animation is explained as having your meshes move in 3D space. We all know about movies like Toy Story and Monsters Inc., which is good examples of animations done right. Rigging. To animate a mesh, you need to control it, but in a way that doesn't require you to manually move each vertex by itself. So this is what you would call a rig. Skinning. For the mesh to actually adhere and be bind to the rig, it needs to be skinned. It's basically just telling the vertices which part of that skeleton or rig to follow. Controllers. When the mesh has a rig and it's skinned to that rig, we need an easy way to access the skeleton. That's what we have controllers for. It's kind of like skinning the rig itself to some simple to access pieces. We can easily move the mesh about and start animating. Rendering. I know this one is a bit hard to grasp, but I'll try to put it simple. Rendering is how we visualize the data and take things like lighting and material into the calculation. An easy way to think of rendering is to just think of it as the computer's way to calculate how light behaves in the scene. Maybe there is reflective surfaces that the light needs to bounce off, etc., giving us bounce light or indirect lighting in some areas. Maybe we have a super rough surface and it doesn't reflect as much light. This is what gets calculated when we render. Compositing. Compositing is a term that we often use when we talk about visual effects. Compositing is the magic of putting renders together into one cohesive render. If you have a person in front of a green screen, it allows you to take that person in front of a picture. In reality, that would be two different renders put together, aka compositing. Assets. Assets, it's just what we call our meshes, models, textures, sounds. It's everything that we can use to create a scene. Everything that we have as part of our setup or that we use in Unreal or Maya or any of the softwares to create a bigger scene. Primitives. In most 3D softwares, there are some basic shapes, like a cube or sphere. As these are as basic as we can get of a model, we call them a primitive. Kinda like the first of its kind. Like Neanderthals were primitive humans. Gizmo. Inside of the 3D software, there are often a thing that is red, blue, and green at the center of a primitive when you bring it into the viewport. This is how you would move, rotate, or scale your mesh. It's depicted in each of the dimension X, Y, and Z, as we talked about in the beginning of the video. Thank you so much for watching this video. If there were some words you felt were missing, leave a comment down below and we'll make another part 2 covering more words and hard to understand subjects when it comes to the 3D world. Also, make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter for the latest. We also try to live stream a few times a week on Twitch, so make sure to head over to Twitch and follow us over there to see more behind the scenes stuff. And of course, hit that subscribe button to make sure that you catch the next video. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.